Erik ist anelikt.
Այո։ Հա։
Ասիլանդո։
Չէ, իրանք են դա։ Չէ։ Ջուր է։ Ծուացել։
Ջուր։
Դες բալակոկերը որտեղ։
Ես այդ բլոկով ջուրը ծատրի իրիկին եմ տանը վրա դրած։
Հա։
Զգացի, բայց ինչքան գնաց։
Չէ, նոր է։ Բայց էսի պուշկա է։
Պուշկա է։ Այսա կդուզեմ։
Այսինքն հեսա կդուզեմ։ Ավելի ինչ խոսացում պետք է կոնկրետ։
Մենակ իր ձայնը չէ երևում։
Խոսացողների է, կոնկրետ ով խոսում է։
Հա, այդ պետք է։ Լավ, սուկեն ինչ եմ անում, երեխեք սուկեն ուղարկում, որ դավայ է։
У нас работает.
Всё работает, можно?
Имаме угարկекин.
Анжатон,
Люди что красивые, понимаешь? Мы сказали, что в 12:30 по московскому времени.
Նա դարի դվենք հա մեր զորուկը հասկացի։
Մեկել բան եմ մտածում, public տանք իրան, թե անվիստուր։
Չէ, ոչի
Public, հա։
Ո՞ս փակտա։ Յանքին շատ նայում ունեք, մտի փակտա։
Ցուցակը
Շեֆներ երեք ասա։
Ծոր գիտեմ, դի ինգեմ ետա։ Անջտել է։ Շպիոն է։
Սրա պիոն։
Чем караса? Что мне делать вот с этой ссылкой? Можешь мне сказать?
Այկո։ Հիմա հա 1 2 3 4 5 6 բարև ձեզ ռաս Էրիկա հələ փորձի
Раз. Раз.
Akhir varlık.
That one, is it?
Yeah, but the motor is there, so you.
I have to point here.
Yes.
It's that one, is it?
Երեք օր 39.
You.
Այո.
Battery problem, maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
It's good we tested
And
it.
Gohar just said that the classes will over in 5 minutes and a lot of students will come.
Okay, yeah.
Because they have classes now, so after finishing they will come back.
Very good. Thank you. Very good.
Professor Reinert, my name is Armenia. I'm a rector of this university. It's my big pleasure having you as a guest of honor. So thank you for honoring us. I'm sure that the lecture and the discussions after will be of a great interest.
I tried to pick up information as much as I could with Georgie on Armenia and try to make it fit the context.
I'm sure
I
you
try
will
to.
make an excellent lecture and presentation. And I think we will have time, of course, during your visit here to more closely to discuss and to have conversation meetings with Dina we will have today.
Okay,
So,
very good.
Good luck.
Thank you very much. Classes are finishing and people will coming on, so.
Okay. So thank you. Very good.
languages, and the covers kind of reflect different national cultures. Different from what you've usually had. I think the key activities are qualitatively different, right? Which is not what you normally hear. I mean, for those of you who are economists, you know that the trade theory that dominates the world is David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage. And in David Ricardo, all economic activities are alike. He produced a theory of international trade based on the bartering of labor hours, right? And all these labor hours are identical, right? So if you have a model where everything coming into it is identical, of course what comes out is also likely to be identical. So the first type of economic activities are subject to diminishing returns to scale. That's when one factor of production is limited by an act of nature. This is agriculture, land, it's mining and fisheries. And after a certain point, if you specialize in one of these products, after a certain point your productivity will decrease as your production goes up, right? So the more you produce, the less productive you will be. And this is combined with that these products tend to be commodities, right? If you produce commodities, you read in the newspapers how much the market is willing to pay for your goods. You know, if you are that's not the way Bill Gates works, right? He doesn't read in the newspaper how much they're willing to pay for Windows 19 or whatever. So very early in the Bible, the tribes of Israel split up. And they split up because the land could not carry them. Their substance was too great. They had too many animals, right? So Alfred Marshall in Neoclassical Economics, in his famous textbooks from 1890, says that and he quotes the Genesis from the Bible, and he says, all migrations, all big migrations in history have been, the cause for all these migrations have been diminishing returns. I put it slightly differently. It has been the absence of increasing returns, right? So people move from countries without increasing returns, and they go to countries with increasing returns. You know, if you're an average African agricultural country like Eritrea, when you reach 40 person per square kilometers, well, that's too much. And then the Eritreans start going, for instance, to Holland, and in Holland there are 400 people per square kilometers, but they can absorb the jobs, right? So there's something very basic here. And then the second category is neutral one. Productivity varies little with volume of production. You know, the barbers and the house painters, traditional service industries. If you have a painter and ask him how much does it cost to paint this house, say 100, and what kind of discount can you give me if you also paint my neighbor's house, which is identical? Well, he won't be able to give you much discount, does he? Because it's all variable costs. And then you come to increasing returns. Productivity increases strongly with the large volume of production. And this creates high barriers to entry, right? These fixed costs create high barriers to entry. And imperfect competition. And innovations tend to spread in terms of higher profits and in terms of higher wages. Notice the difference with the commodities and the diminishing returns. So Henry Ford, around 1915, he decided to double the wages of his workers. And one reason he had to do that was it was a very monotonous work, but the typical of what an industrialist can do, that I need people like my own workers to be able to afford a car. Therefore, I double the wages to $5 a day. Right? A farmer can't do that. A farmer can't say, well, I want my workers to eat more carrots, so I double the wages of the farmhands. It doesn't work, right? And this is something, this taxonomy here of different economic activities is something that economists kind of know. But it isn't compatible with equilibrium. So what has been driving economics is the idea of the metaphor of equilibrium. And if you have increasing and diminishing returns, you don't do that. You don't get that. So in the 1930s, they threw out increasing and diminishing returns in order to get room for equilibrium. Right? So I'm saying something which you find in a footnote. You know, Paul Krugman rediscovered this in the early 1980s, but he stopped writing about it because he said, Lenin was right about imperialism. Well, that wouldn't have given him a Nobel Prize, so he stopped talking about that, right? So, but it's something that if you really dig, good economists know it. So there is some interesting aspect here about the Cold War. You know, I'm a product of the Cold War. I was born about when the Cold War really started. And we have been thinking of the Cold War as being extremely, you know, two extremely different systems. And we haven't really seen the similarities of these two systems, right? Because we only saw the differences, the plan versus the market, etc. But some of you are old enough to remember stamps, right? And to the left here is a stamp from West Germany. And to the right is a stamp from East Germany. And they both portray the same person, Friedrich List, who was a German economist, who, against English economics, proved the importance of industry, of manufacturing industry. So this is probably interesting thing is that this cult of Friedrich List kind of stopped with neoliberalism. You know, capitalism knew it, communism knew it, but when communism died, capitalism kind of forgot it. And here is a key person born in Tbilisi. Sergei Witte was the man who translated Friedrich List into Russian. He was Minister of Finance under the last two Tsars, and he was writing a couple of interesting secret memorandum to the Tsars. One of them was, well, forget about all this empty land in Siberia. Industrialize around Moscow, then Russia will become richer than by getting all this empty land. And when the Bolsheviks took over, you know, most people in the administration were sacked, but not the few people who worked in Sergei Witte's industrialization department. So in 1930, when people looked around, well, what are these Bolsheviks really doing? They were saying, well, they're just essentially only following the plan of Mr. Witte, but under a different heading, right? And I think this is important, and this is what conservative, right-wing people used to know, but which neoliberalists absolutely disregard. Well, the other personality I want or the third personality I want to introduce here is Joseph Schumpeter. And Schumpeter was a very conservative also. Three ambitions in life. He wanted to be Vienna's best lover, Austria's best horseman, and the world's best economist. And with hindsight, he had to admit he had some problems with the horses. So this is the kind of guy we're talking about. But if you look at his economic theory, it is very similar to that of Marx, driven by manufacturing, driven by industry, by innovations. The important thing is the stuff that breaks equilibrium. Equilibrium is unimportant. That's when nothing happens in 200 years. Well, then you get equilibrium. But that's not very important. The important stuff is what breaks equilibrium. So these are kind of the three personalities here. Well, in order to look into this theory, I spent sweating a few days well, about a week in Guayaquil in Ecuador. Just an example. In the 1960s, there was a disease on all the bananas in Central America. So for a while, Ecuador became virtually the only supplier of large-scale supplier of bananas. So you can see here that their area cultivated, the green dots, doubled. But what happened was that productivity went down. So you can see that the productivity is actually a mirror image of the area, right? And this is diminishing returns. And this is what happens to any nation going into specializing in raw materials. We should produce wool. But if we only produce wool, we will go into producing wool where it's not very suited. So we have to have an industry. So we have to have a manufacturing industry to set a minimum wage to stop going into diminishing returns. So there are countries which have understood this very well, but it's not that normal. And there's only one province in Ecuador, Provincia del Oro, which is really suited for bananas. But it took this disaster to prove it. Rich nations go through periodical productivity explosions. This is the labor productivity in cotton spinning from the late 1700s up until about 2000. And you see there's one big peak there where labor productivity actually increases by more than 25% a year, right? And then you have two kinds of economists. You have Adam Smith, who says, oh, look what free trade can do. And then you have the German economist who said, look what technology can do, right? And the problem is that the German economists died out. They were thrown out with the bathing water after World War II. Perhaps for good reasons, but we're missing them. I just published a 600-page book on German economics. In the 1990s, there was something was described as Moore's law. And Moore's law says that about every 18 months, the capacity on the silicon chip doubles. Well, if you draw that, it looks a bit like that. And at the moment, solar panels seem to behave a bit like that, right? That you have these productivity explosions. Putting these mechanisms in reverse produce some strange phenomena. This is Russian economy from the disastrous year 1992 and onwards. This is production. You see it's cut by 50%. This is the index, well, we knew that. This is the index of agricultural production, which also cut by 50%. Not only did they stop producing machinery, they also stopped producing potatoes to some extent, right? And here are the real wages, which go a bit. Comes the surprising part of this, which is the real exchange rate. So you ask the question, well, the economy is going down the drain. Why is the ruble revaluing? What's this? Well, if the Mercedes dealers of Moscow were to set the exchange rate, this is the exchange rate they would want to kill all Russian car production, right? But I think this is partly American advisors from well-known universities who came and advised Russia on shock therapy, and the shock therapy was not a very good idea. And in fact, a famous university in the United States was taken to court by the US Department of Justice and fined $19 million for its activities in Russia. These are things that, of course, never come out. But but this was an unnecessarily big disaster, and I think Russia never got over it. And 3 years ago, I was invited to the Gaidar conference, and who was the big hero presented there? Well, it was Jeffrey Sachs, the man who had created this disaster. So I came up with the idea that in fact Russia seems to suffer from the Stockholm syndrome, that they identified with the people who have done them harm. And I asked my Russian friends, well, can I say this? In a book, I wrote a book called Spontaneous Chaos, which was translated into Russian and Serbian. And they said, yes, because you're a foreigner, you can actually say that, right? And I think the fact that this has not been sufficiently analyzed it is important. And what you see there is ruble, I think it's August 1997. In about a week, he had money enough to buy a bicycle, right? So this was the devaluation, which of course should have happened over time and not like that. But this was in the interest of the financial people, the people who wanted to get as many rubles out to buy houses in London as possible, right? Okay. Opa. We keep jumping here. So this is a graph. This is the one which is not working. Oh, do we have a work? Yeah. Well, yeah. Does this? Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. This is a paper from a paper that I produced with an Estonian colleague. We call it the Latin Americanization of Europe. That Latin America lost its industry in the late 70s, Brazil 20 years later. And here is Armenia, 1990, industry 30.4%. This is Armenia, 2001, in the manufacturing industry 14.1%. Right. So this is a serious case, similar to Russia. Then you have the Czech Republic, industry 45.5%, and Czechia here is yeah. So you see, these countries were not hurt. 54, and you also have Hungary. 33 over here, and it goes up tremendously. Why? Because they did not have a shock therapy. The Tungsram factory delivering light bulbs to the Soviet Empire was sold to General Electric in 1992. Right? So they did the slow thing, and they managed to upgrade their technology and didn't have the shock therapy. So the different experiences here are very interesting. What's also very interesting is that some of these countries, you see that people move back into agriculture. Armenia, agriculture was 17.7%, and then in 2001 it was 44%. So if there is room to move back to agriculture, they do that. In the countries where agriculture is gone, they move into the so-called service sector, which tends to be slums. It tends to be the big cities. So there's a lot to read out of this. If we look at the United States, a similar movement was, I mentioned Ford. The Fordist wage regime is a name given by French economists to the idea that when there is a 4%, let's say, call it 4% productivity increase in the leading industries, wages go up by 4%. Right? And then everybody's wages go up by 4%, even those of the barber. He increases his prices by 4%. And this Fordist wage regime had an interesting effect of keeping the relative shares of capital and labor about the same. Right? But you see here it breaks up, productivity, this is Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US. Productivity goes up, but real wages flatten out, and then people, to keep their living standard, they take up loans, and then you have the beginning of a financial crisis. That happened later in Europe, but it happened. And Mr. Piketty has been writing about this, but I think James Galbraith, an American economist, was the one who actually produced the best, very short solution. This was created by labor unions. Right? Labor unions made that possible. And when the labor unions died out, well, you get David Ricardo has an interesting law that the natural wage level is subsistence. Why should anybody pay his workers more than the worker needs to show up for work the next morning, right? So we're getting into the iron law of wages. These are really very old ideas, and with my wife, who is a librarian, we've been looking at well, since the mid-70s, we've been looking at economic bestsellers. Which economics books were published in more than 10 editions before 1850? And some of these people, some of them you've never heard of. They're like, oh, William Shakespeare we know, but the equivalent of Shakespeare in the 1600s was this guy Giovanni Botero, who was published in 38 editions in most European languages between 1589 and 1671. And Botero's idea is of the clues to wealth is manufacturing added value and diversity. He says you have to see the difference between a heap of logs and a heap of stones and a house. And the difference is man's creativity. And he would also say, well, if you want to know the wealth of a city, go into the city and count the number of professions. I think that's still valid. If you go into Kampala and count the number of professions, and you go into London, well, the number of professions is the same. So this is essentially the same thing. And another Italian economist in 1613 says that this is due to increasing and diminishing returns. So the theory was already there. And I digged out, when I did my thesis in the late 70s at Cornell, I dug out the oldest economist book I could find, and this was this guy Serra, and I looked that he was actually right. The diminishing returns is what creates poverty. Well, I don't know if we have a battery. Well, we don't. And there are two very interesting contradictory movements in Europe after World War II. First, it was the rediscovery of on the practical level. I don't know if somebody can. Somebody offered here to help me doing this. Maybe it needs a female hand. I'm not sure. So when I say the next, so perhaps you can we can have a seat over there or whatever. Yeah. So the worst punishment the Allies could think of was to deindustrialize Germany. Germany had created 2 wars in less than 50 years. So then they produced American Secretary of State Henry Morgenthau created a plan in 1943 to deindustrialize Germany. Next. And here is where we come, what I already mentioned, the natural wage level was subsistence. And wages fell so much in West Germany that the Americans understood that something was wrong, because the Morgenthau plan was in the French, in the US, and the English zone, but not in the Russian zone. So because of the deindustrialization in West Germany, actually people moved to East Germany. And communism looked more successful in Germany than did capitalism. So they found out they had to stop the Morgenthau. Next one. Herbert Hoover, the old vice president, he was wise. He was sent to Germany to see what was wrong. And he'd been in Germany after World War I, so he knew the place. He was a mining engineer. Huh? He writes this, there is the illusion that the new Germany left after the annexations can be reduced to a pastoral state without industry. It cannot be done unless we exterminate or move 25 million people out of it. So he established that old link from the Bible of diminishing returns. If we remove industry, there is room for 25 million Germans less. And notice the word exterminate. In 1947, that was a pretty rough word. We have to exterminate or move 25 million people out of it. So then came the Marshall Plan, which we know better than the Morgenthau Plan. And the Marshall Plan was to re-industrialize Germany. And to go with it was the Havana Charter, which was the beginning of the WTO, which allowed for industrial policy, which allowed for a lot of things. And while they were at it, the United States created a sanitary belt of wealthy countries around Soviet and China. So from Norway up north, all through Western Europe, down to Turkey, and Thailand, and Taiwan, and Korea, South Korea, and Japan, they all had a Marshall Plan, so they got rich. Right? And that was an extremely successful way of stopping communism, to industrialize these countries. But the problem was that when the Cold War was won, this was forgotten. Right? And this is one of the problems of Armenia, I would say, that this stuff was forgotten. Right? Next. Well, this is what I was mentioning. Agricultural societies. Yeah, go on. And we have, when George Marshall made his speech at Harvard University announcing the Marshall Plan, he says, there is a phase of this matter which is both interesting and serious. The farmer has always produced the foodstuffs to exchange with the city dwellers for the other necessities of life. This division of labor is the basis of modern civilization. That's a pretty strong statement, right? And Marshall was not an economist. He was the first 5-star general in the U.S. Armed Forces. So he had been in charge of logistics for all the armed forces during World War II. Quite a task, right? So this is somebody who actually was an experienced, and we can have the quote here at the end. So there was a lot of theory in Marshall's little speech at Harvard. And if we go back in time, we find that economists understood this. Reinaldo Galliani, Italian economist, from manufacturing you may expect the two greatest ills of humanity, superstition and slavery, to be healed. And look at, I've been dealing with the Muslim Council of Singapore. They are publishing some of my stuff, right? And then you can say, well, Muslims under manufacturing conditions in Singapore behave very differently from the Muslims in the desert, right? So I think this, in a sense, is still valid. And we see slavery coming back. Well, we see slavery coming back where there's no manufacturing. Galliani was, according to Nietzsche, the wisest man of his century. So he was not anybody. So if we look at, we'll stop it there for a while. Sweden is a typical successful welfare state. And Sweden is relatively simple because you can explain a lot by only 3 people. Marcus Wallenberg, the big capitalist, his economic advisor, Erik Dahmén, who was a Schumpeterian economist, and Gunnar Sträng, who was the last almost feudal farmer. In Sweden, he was very poor and was a minister of state in Sweden for for 27 years, most of the time as a minister of the economy. So Wallenberg, Dahmén worked in Wallenberg's bank. They had lunch every Wednesday, and they discussed, and Dahmén had this idea of development blocks. So we said, we make a development block around cars and trucks and buses, and then we have another development block around refrigerators and kitchenware and those things, right? And then a third one was medicine. So this was pure theory. And then Dahmén and Streng were really often speaking, I understand, almost once a week. So Mr. Wallenberg, the capitalist, presented this to the Labour Minister of Finance, and the Labour Minister of Finance said, fine, go ahead as long as we get our share of the cake. As long as we get, if there's 4% productivity increase, we want 4% wage increase. Right? So this is John Kenneth Galbraith in his American Capitalism, created this idea of the balance of countervailing power, that actually the capitalist system was working at its best when you had big business, big labor, and big government. And then we managed to kill big labor, we managed to kill big government, and now there's only big business left, and that has created certain imbalances, I think, also in the US. So, next one, please. This is another graph. This one is produced by Branko Milanovic, a former World Bank economist. And the interesting thing here is that some countries were much wealthier under communism. Ukraine, Montenegro, Serbia, Georgia. And some got richer. I don't understand the Armenian thing here because it doesn't drive with the other one. But an interesting thing is Belarus. Belarus is much wealthier than under communism, and that is not because Lenin is left there on the square. It's not because of Lenin's statue, but it's actually because they hung on to the ideas of Friedrich List. So here, democracies have a tremendous disadvantage. If you try to be a democracy, like Georgia and Ukraine, you cannot protect your industry. And industry dies out, right? So this is, I know that this is something that a lot of economists disagree with me, but I had although my theories essentially come from Harvard Business School, I had the unpleasant experience of having my Wikipedia website, which a German colleague put up, having being vandalized over years. It was put correct last week. So I understand that economists shake their head in their audience, but there's something intuitive here. Armenian parents, even though they're economists, they don't tell their children, my daughter, my son, you are so good at washing dishes. You obviously have a comparative advantage in washing dishes, so go out and get a career. Right? As private individuals using their common sense, they don't say that. But when they come to making decisions on behalf of nations, it's David Ricardo who rules, right? And to David Ricardo, as I said, all economic activities are alike. So this is like saying, well, it's better to be a mediocre lawyer in Yerevan than to be the best dishwasher in Yerevan, right? And this is the same kind of intuition with manufacturing industry. It's better to have a relatively inefficient industry than to have none at all. Right? And I think this is what's coming back. The good thing about Trump is that the hypocrisy of free trade, he broke the hypocrisy of free trade. I think that's the best thing you can say about Mr. Trump. So we'll get back to the next one. These are the wages of the Ukraine compared to Belarus. I had it done by an economist who did. So this is current dollars. So don't look at the ups and downs. The ups and downs are dollars, right? Look at the difference between the two curves. Here they start out the Ukraine being wealthier in the late 90s, and here you are in a situation in 2017 where the real wages in Belarus are 50% higher than those of the Ukraine. Right? And it's not because of Lenin, it's because of Friedrich List. Right? And I think these are the kinds of things that are now being discovered with Trump and company. So next one. Mexico, real wages peaked in 1977. So this is, it's happened all over Latin America. It's only coming to Europe later. Next one. So in the United States, in the 1820s, they used to say, don't do what the West tells you to do. The United States said, don't do as the English tell you to do like the English do. So I think today we would say, don't do what the World Bank and the IMF tells you to do. Do as the major shareholders of the IMF and the World Bank did, which is, they've all been through the same thing, right? Next one. So some pieces of strategic advice. Add value to your raw materials. If you are the Ukraine, it's not a good idea to sell wheat to Italy for $400 a ton and import spaghetti back for $4,000 a ton. No, that's not a program on wise specialization, on smart specialization, they call it. And what I liked about that is that they admit indirectly that there is something called stupid specialization, right? Which is in this wheat program. So if you might want to do like in Uzbekistan, that if you really want Italian spaghetti, it costs 5 times as much. But if you want Uzbek spaghetti, well, it's also a blue packet very close to that of Buitoni, and it's next to the Buitoni one, but it costs a fifth. Right. So I think this is wise specialization. This adding value to raw materials is crucial. And also that free trade is always beneficial among countries at the same level of technological sophistication. Norway and Sweden were each other's biggest customer in spite of being very small countries in the 50s and 60s. So small countries, find somebody at the same level of development and try to trade with them. It's not easy in the case of Armenia, but don't trade with people who are much more sophisticated than yourself. That's often a problem. Next one. Quick fix. Big wine producer, low value added. And then they prohibited all export of wine in bulk, and they exported only bottled wine. Value added in bottles, printing, labels, bottling, and cartons, export values of Chilean wine more than double. Of course, this was against the rules of the WTO, but Pinochet didn't care, did he? Right? And this is the interesting thing, that Pinochet was an evil man, but he was not a neoliberal. He was a fascist. Right? And to the political right, you have two different rights. You have the fascists, which were an awful bunch, but they understood manufacturing, right? And the neoliberals didn't. So I think we have to recover the good things about communism, the good things right and left without getting the bad things. Comparative advantage was coined by David Ricardo in 1817. The idea of comparative advantage, which is so central today. Beginning of the Cold War, you see comparative advantage grows. These are n-grams. This is quotations. This is the frequency of that term in all English books, millions and millions of books, and you get the frequency. And you see the frequency stops here in the late 1980s, and then they stopped talking about it. I think that was the most surprising. Okay, the war is won. We have we can even stop talking about comparative advantage. Next one. glad you have problems too. David Ricardo rose to fame during the Cold War. He was really not a very important economist. This is the important economist in England in the 19th century was John Stuart Mill, who I mentioned, his 1848 book. It was his father, James Mill. And David Ricardo is down here, really nobody. So I think the communists gave us the idea, the utopia of from each according to ability and to each according to need, right? That was the utopia. David Ricardo, in 1948-49, he was reinterpreted by Paul Samuelson, and he proved under the standard conditions of economics that you would get factor price equalization if everyone had free trade. You know, the wages and the cost of capital would tend to be the same all over the world. And this was such a welcome message during the Cold War that the West jumped on it. So the two utopias, the communist utopia and the Ricardian utopia, were competing, right? And of course, you know, when we had a German economist talking about a famous German economist, he was the rector of the University of Berlin. He talked about the two irrational twins, and that was communism and Manchester liberalism. So when one of the crazy twins, communism, died, you know, the other twin, Manchester liberalism, took over, and these, I think this is the source of many of our problems today. So let's move to the next one. Two types of economics. I'm really trying to, let's take the next one as well. That one, yeah. After, you know, this was the age of triumphalism after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Norwegian economist, really basing it on Milton Friedman. One of the nice things about economics is that it's only a way of thinking. Factual knowledge does not exist. I think that's very interesting. It kind of says, don't disturb us with facts, right? It's only a way of thinking. And then you have the counterpart. Let's move on to the next one too. The root of everything we can call theory is to observe things as they are. These are two very different approaches to theory. And because economics got into physics envy, they wanted to be like physics, as accurate as physics, you know, we got stuck with get back to is to observe things as they are. And then and that means that economics has to be a bit like medical science, that you have different nations suffer from different illnesses and there are different remedies, and a good doctor actually matches the remedies to the illness. So, next one. I think this period looks a bit like in 1848 and the previous period, which was around 1720, that the core theory, the elites, their theory collapses because it's attacked both from the right and the left at the same time. You know, what happened in the United States? Trump is against free trade, Sanders is against free trade, so both the political extremes suddenly turned against free trade. And this is exactly what happened in 48. Let's get the next ones. You had the repeal of the Corn Laws, the big victory of free trade in 1846, a big financial crisis in England in 47, bad harvests in 48, and you have Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto. Marx was so radical he had to flee to England. You have another German economist, Economics of the Present and the Future. He was so conservative that in 1851 he had to flee to Switzerland. Right? So here are people all over the political map. And the third one is, as I mentioned, John Stuart Mill, Principles of Political Economy. Here is English liberalism recanting on free trade, saying every country to get rich needs infant industry protection. Back to the idea of not sending your children to the labor market too early on. Next one. So this is an 1848 moment when the old order collapses because it's attacked from the political right, and the political left at the same time. So it's the end of the left-right axis in a way, and it's the beginning of a new economic theory at a much lower level of abstraction. It's an economic theory where you have at least the three categories that I mentioned: increasing returns, diminishing returns, and constant returns to scale. If you have those three, if you have that simple taxonomy, well, you can see a lot. Yes. Yeah. Let's move to as I said, Trump and Sanders. No, yeah, you have the same problem I have. I'm glad. Yes. And another thing which is finishing soon. Another thing which is coming back. Well, in Germany, there are a stock of words that were used during Nazi period, which you cannot use anymore. They're kind of prohibited words. And as not being a German, I think these terms are interesting, funny, etc. So I have to ask my German friends, can I use this term? And sometimes they say, no, can't use that. It's too. If you say entartet about something, you know, that's awful. You can't use that word. But an interesting word which popped up and was very important for Hitler to get his victory was the idea of Zinsknechtschaft, interest serfdom. That Germany had been forced into so much debt after World War I that they were serfs having to, you know, they only were working to pay their debt. And I understood there was you could translate this into Russian and get a similar term. But the interesting thing now is that what's happening in Europe is that Germany has a huge export surplus and is forcing the periphery of Europe into the same kind of debt serfdom that the Germans were themselves accusing the rest of the world of. I think this is a big irony. And Italy is has a heavy debt. Greece has a heavy debt. And under normal circumstances, if a debt is unpayable, it should the company or the state should go bankrupt. You know, even England has gone bankrupt. Argentina must have gone bankrupt 4 or 5 times. And the early historians of capitalism say, well, what were the key elements of capitalism? Well, first of all, you needed double entry bookkeeping because you had to measure how much capital you had. The other criterion for capitalism was bankruptcy. Right? And I think here the Ukraine is in company with a lot of other countries. Neighbor Georgia, for instance, Ukraine, and not to mention Greece. And here is a problem that Keynes called the paradox of savings. In order to pay your debt, you should really start saving a lot. But if you save a lot, your economy would shrink even more. So the fact that saving from a country's point of view becomes counterproductive, that it actually makes the country worse off. And this is something that the EU clearly is not understanding. Right? And an American friend of mine who's writing about these things, he says that, you know, the euro is like a Ponzi scheme. It's like a pyramid game. In the end, it has to collapse. So you have problems with debt, but most countries do. And Keynes in Bretton Woods had the idea that countries with a large surplus should pay a tax on the surplus to the international community. You know, that would have stopped China and Germany from having all these surpluses. But that was vetoed by the United States, who would now have needed it, right? So there are some ideas out there that can be picked up. So skip that one, and we come to this, which is when I studied in Switzerland, University of St. Gallen, this is the last slide, in the early 70s, this was on the blackboard. And economics consists of 2 different things. The real economy, what Schumpeter called the Güterwelt, the world of goods and services, and the financial economy, which he called the Rechenpfennige, which would be like accounting units. You know, money is really accounting units. And if you are in the real economy and want to build a factory, well, you go to the financial economy and you get money for 50 years and you pay it back with interest. So this is the symbiosis of finance capital and real capital, which the Muslims never got to, right? Because they prohibited financial capital in a way. But for a long time, Western capitalism did very well with this, right? And if you read Martin Luther is just as the Muslims. He was very afraid of idle capital taking over, mammon, dead capital taking over. Luther was as worried as the Muslims in a sense. But he said, well, we need capital. He tried to force loan capital into equity. That they should, instead of loaning money to the company, they should be owners and share the risk. That would be fair. But he admitted it. But we've had that under control for a long time. But sometimes I think it's very boring to sit there and loan money and wait for 50 years. So they start making these financial schemes. So the financial economy is growing upon itself. And then we risk that the financial economy becomes a parasite. This is symbiosis. But if we let the financial capital rule, well, we have some problems. Keynes solved the problem after the 1930s by creating jobs. Mario Draghi is solving the problems by printing money. And was a taxi driver was working for the European Union. They have in Seville they have a research institute, and the taxi driver on the way told me, he didn't know I was an economist. He said, well, Mario Draghi is printing all this money, and all this money is going into raising the prices of apartments in Spain, and because the price of the apartments go up, the rent go up, but our wages stay the same. To balance, and the problem of neoclassical economics is that they don't distinguish this well enough. So I asked one of my Marxist friends in the US, well, why haven't the Marxists got the point? Under the financial crisis, this is something that Marx understood, along with people from all along the political axis. And he says, well, you see, the problem is that this is in volume 3 of Das Kapital. And modern Marxists only read volume 1. So I think there are things here to rediscover all along the political axis, and there are things to rediscover from history. And I realize Armenia is in a very peculiar situation, but I think there is something there about the crisis, about the debt, and about the value added, which hopefully can be of some strategic use. Thank you.
Thank you very much first for a very interesting presentation. I enjoyed it. Just, deindustrialization problem. And now countries should be reindustrialized. I agree with you. But it is very difficult to do under the free trade regime. It's sort of catch-22. You cannot do it because you need to protect your industry. And as far as I know economic history, every country did that. When Britain was the factory of the world, they have zero zero protection. But France have, Germany have, all of them had. So now, sort of world is against that. So how are we going to get from this catch-22? What do you think? Thank you.
Well, I think that is a very good question, and of course, England was protecting their industry for 300 years before Ricardo. But if we look into the case of value added, there is one. There are a lot of bad examples from Russia, but there's one good one, and that has to do with poultry. In the 1990s, the Russians were importing chicken from the United States, and they called it bush legs, right? It was the cheapest part of the chickens. And then, with a minimum of tariffs and some sanitary regulations, I think, they managed to build a poultry industry very, very fast. Right? So Russia becomes self-sufficient in poultry. So I think these are the kinds of things you can do. So I would say, look at your import bill and see where are the big items. And then you see, what can we produce ourselves with a minimum of cheating? EU removed the last 10% duty on Japanese cars on 31st of December 2017. You know, all countries cheat. So the question is what kind of cheating you can get away with. And Ukraine got away with not exporting raw timber. And that worked pretty well. But I must warn you from dealing with the EU, because they put on very unfair treaties. Ukraine signed an agreement with the EU about 1,060 pages, and according to my sources in Parliament, 2 people had read it, right? And very worried about garlic, it's not many other things. But the problem is that in order to get access for the population to move into the EU, these countries have signed things they shouldn't have signed. Now, in Japanese and Chinese history, there's something called unfair treaties. The treaties that the US and the English forced China and Japan to sign. Well, we have a similar case here. You know, Ukraine and Georgia should never have signed those things. And also because Ukraine, with its agricultural surplus, you know, they can't sell it. Their quotas for a whole year run out in February. And then somebody comes from Brussels and says, oh, we're very generous, we give you more quota for tomatoes, and that lasts for 3 weeks. Right? So you know, there's so much cheating going on also on these agricultural products. You know, you could think, well, let's export walnuts to Europe. Well, the European walnut market is cornered by whom? By the Americans. So I spent a couple of months in Spain, and all the walnuts, Spain can grow walnuts, but these were walnuts dumped on the EU market, subsidized by the Americans. So there is the game is very dirty out there. So I think my best advice would be to have these principles in mind, you know, added value, and see what you can do. Let's say if you have clay, if you have kaolin, well, start making tiles and export the tiles to Russia or wherever, you know. But it has to be kind of specific at this point, I think, in your case. And of course, this country is wonderful for tourism, but tourism creates jobs, but at the lowest level in all countries, right? Wage levels. So you need some wage-creating activities, some job-creating activities where tourism is fine, and then you need some wage-increasing activities, which would be manufacturing, and do some import substitution, perhaps in poultry or whatever else you can do. I was in Mongolia, and they were importing the water from Hong Kong. In the government building, you know, there was canned water from Hong Kong in Ulaanbaatar. You know, of course you don't do crazy things like that, but they happen in the so-called market. These crazy things happen. So I realize your situation is not very easy, but I think you have an entrepreneurial population, and some countries like Ireland is a good case. Ireland had a lot of people migrating, right? Brain drain. And then they got into information technology. I worked in Ireland in 1980, and we put up a program in information technology very early on. And the first graduates from Trinity College in Dublin in information technology all left for Silicon Valley. Year number 2, one guy stayed behind, but after 8 years, all these people came back from Silicon Valley to raise their children in Ireland. So you could convert brain drain to brain gain. Well, that was because they were very early on. They were very early in a new technology. I'm not saying you can do that. You know, you can't compete with Bangalore in wages. So it's complicated, but at least if you know what you're looking for, you're looking for increasing returns. You have a portrait of what you would like to see in your country. That helps. And I think the entrepreneurial skills be an asset.
Thank you, Professor. Other questions, please. Please.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Erik, and I'm a lecturer here at the Armenia University of Economics. I have a lot of questions that I want to ask one about the last diagram and about the level of monetization. In Armenia, it's around 21-22%, the level of monetization. So the money is, we have a lot of demand of money and not much of supply. And in other countries like China and others, the level of monetization is higher, bigger than one. And my question is, how much the level of monetization in Armenia should be, and how much so the market can respond to that equilibrium should be, like the state of equilibrium between the state of equilibrium. Thank you.
Well, I will admit that is beyond it's outside my sphere of competence. You know, I'm working with other people doing the financial economy. Jan Kregel is one of them, and I don't think I can give you a qualified reply to that. But I can say one thing is that if you have a high debt and the debt is in foreign currency, well, it's very tempting to keep your exchange rate high. But if you keep your exchange rate high, you kill your own industry and agriculture. So there's a tremendous problem there. In the old days, you know, Italy had a lot of debt, but all the debt was in lira. So it was like the right pocket owing money to the left pocket, and it wasn't a problem, right? So when debt became internationalized, you get into this tremendous dilemma of exchange rates, right? So well, that would be my comment on the margins of that, but sorry I can't help you more.
Thank you, Professor. Other questions,
please. Thank you for your presentation. Vartan Bagdasaryan, Yerevan State University, PhD of Economics. Poland is very often described as a successful story of transformation among former communist countries, and it is very often brought as an example of successful shock therapy. In your personal opinion, is it because of the shock therapy of Minister Balcerowicz in Poland, or in spite of it, the country get the success? Thank you.
Well, I would tend to say in spite of it. Well, Poland had some very unique advantages. And one of them, well, there was a revolution in Hungary in 1956, but there was also a very important revolution in Poland. And Poland refused to collectivize agriculture. That is very, very important. Because when industry died, people could go back to the farm. You know, there was one more person in the potato field. It was not terribly efficient, but at least you know they didn't live in the slums. So first of all, the advantage. I mean, I see in the Baltic countries how difficult it is to recreate farming, especially cattle farming. You know, meat production and cheese production is very difficult to get back. Poultry, anybody can do. Right? So that's number one. And number two was that Poland had a big market. So if you were a Finnish chocolate factory and wanted to produce for Eastern Europe, well, you didn't go to Estonia, which was across the bay, but you went to Poland because of an internal big market. That was also an advantage. A third advantage was that the northern part of Poland was never feudalized. And feudalization, you know, be it southern Italy or wherever, is the long shadow of feudalism is a problem. So the fact that the Polish economist has been writing brilliantly about this, you know, he has a map with, you know, hundreds and hundreds of municipalities in Poland, and I think the old, you know, kind of Germanic part of Poland had the entrepreneurship and so there's several good circumstances. When I'm in Cambridge and I'm hungry, Cambridge, England, and I'm hungry at night, there is only one place you can get food, and there is a Polish guy who has a stand selling food at the marketplace in Cambridge. And he tells me a story. There are three brothers, you know, and they take shifts. They have a luxury restaurant in Poland, they have a farm, and they have this food stand in Cambridge. And they take shifts 3 weeks in each place. So this is very productive, you know. This is getting the best thing out of high-end services, the best thing of getting foreign exchange, and they also stayed in the farm. So yeah, Poland has, but there's some reasons for it, and what they're most afraid of is that they're doing so well that the European Union will force them to get into the euro, because they know that the big advantage is that they can devalue the zloty. That's perhaps the biggest advantage of them all, right? So there are 190 some different countries out there, and their contexts are different. But very often the context can explain a lot. And I think having private agriculture was a big strength, because I've seen the three Baltic countries how they fight in vain to recreate it. You know, once broken, never mended, kind of idea.
Thank you, Professor. Other questions, please.
Oh, thank you. Great presentation. You mentioned about the depth and what next if you are dig into the depth, so to go bankrupt, and if bankrupt, then again, what next? How to live? If you are a businessman, you can bankrupt one company and start up another one. Mm-hmm. You have no other country to start up. So thank you.
No, I think this is a dilemma, and the problem here is that the financial sector has too much say, clearly, and finance as a percentage of GDP is growing. Well, as I said, there are many examples of bankrupt countries, and Argentina has been the worst, probably 4 times, and also a most recent one. And people say, well, you will never get credit back. Well, Argentina, in fact, got some credit back. So I think the best thing is that if the countries who have to go bankrupt, if they talk to each other and try to say, well, this is enough, and Greece will certainly be on that list, and Italy is very soon on that list too. So sooner or later, this is going to happen. But the financial sector will say, they're making keeping this technically dead animal alive gives so much income every year. So if you can just squeeze that lemon a little more, 1 year more, before they're making a lot of money, right? So the power of the fact that this is not part of Anglo-Saxon economics is a big problem. German economics, both right and left, because they understood this very well. I think I thought that the financial crisis would make people aware of that. Well, it didn't. Right. So the big question is why was so little learned from the financial crisis? And I have no good answer except that the financial people are clever and are in power, too big to fail, and all these things. So I think sooner or later there's going to be a wave of bankruptcy, and you start over with a clean slate. You know, the term used is clean slate, which means that the term comes from when you're writing cuneiform script on clay tablets. So it's a very old metaphor, and the problem of debt and insolvency goes back to Hammurabi, 1500 years before Christ. He understood that compound interest, or his mathematicians understood that compound interest will make money grow so much faster than the real economy. You know, 1.05 times 1.05, 2,000 times. You know, the thing there on the right will explode. So he instituted Jubilee years, which is when debt was forgiven. And in the Old Testament, you still have leftovers of Hammurabi with the idea of Jubilee years. So this is something that mankind has known for 3,000 years, but conveniently forgotten now. So it is, in fact, very useful. And if you go into the Bible, you will find mammon, capital not employed, is very bad. You will find the 3 slaves or servants who were left with the sum of money, and the one who dug the money into the ground got punished because he didn't use the money creatively. You know, it was not productive. As Luther would have said, it didn't. You know, the test for Luther was, does it serve life? And if it doesn't serve life, it's no good. Right? So hoarding money is no good, but investing money is serving life, so that's good. Right? So there's so much old wisdom which disappeared with equilibrium mathematics after World War II that it's really sad. But I think it would have to be things have to get worse before they get better. So my hope is that things will get worse really fast, right? Because then we can solve it.
Thank you, Professor.
Armenia Alexandrian, student of RAU. Thank you for your lecture. I have a question about economic integration. As you know, in 214, Armenia became a member of Eurasian Economic Union. So what do you think that unions help to added value in that countries, or in that union healthy countries stay healthy and poor stay poor? For example, Greece in EU. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting that the theoretical paper before Maastricht in 1991 was an Italian economist called Cecchini, and his argument for a bigger single market was economies of scale in manufacturing industry. Economies of scale in manufacturing industry was accounting for something like 85% of the benefits of the EU. He could not foresee that in some countries, like in Greece and Portugal, industry would die out. So, but if he had seen that, he would have said, no, don't let them lose their industry. So we're back to this idea of symmetrical trade, right? So and I think that the countries, and well, I think the Soviet Union slowly also matured to that. From being more imperial, they matured to the idea of symmetrical trade, and they farmed out many activities to the periphery countries. So I think if you are Greece in the European Union, you're in big trouble. If you're Armenia in a customs union with Russia, not necessarily, because when I'm in Ukraine, I ask, what can I say? Can I say so and so? And they say, no, you can't say that. Well, here I understand I can say pretty much anything. So I would say from the point of view of the Ukraine, it would be good for them to trade with Russia because they are on roughly the same level of development, right? But of course I can't say that. But here I can say that I think it would be good for you probably it would be good for you to trade with Russia, much better than to trade with for example Germany or so this beyond the politics of it. I mean the economics of symmetry, these symmetrical ideas, increasing returns industries swap for other increasing returns industries. That's in the interest of both.
Your book is mainly about protectionism, as I understood, and it's one of the main debates now in Armenia. And we have a lot in common with Georgia, and after the revolution they opened their market. They got a lot of investments, mainly in spheres like, I don't know, trade, tourism, but that was not a good fundament for economic growth. And I just wanted to answer, can we do protectionism and get also investments? And are investments so vital for us, for these small countries like us? But taking account two facts, that we are not South Koreans culturally, and also we need some grants from US and from EU. That's all.
Okay, well, I think my book is essentially about the importance of economic structure. What you produce is important. And that leads into, in some cases, protectionism. And there is, there were high-tech pockets in many Soviet republics. And I understand also in Georgia there was something. They had engineers and produced things. Estonia had this Soviet Institute of Cybernetics, and that should normally have died out with like the Czech computer industry was the most advanced, was very advanced. I didn't say it should survive, but it was very advanced. And here geography comes in. The high-tech industries in many countries died out, but it's the Estonians have a language related to Finnish, so the Estonians understand Finnish better than the Finns understand the Estonians, but they've been watching Finnish TV, right? So they understood the capitalist culture in a way, like the Hungarians were doing. They were moving in early, and Soviet technology in Tallinn, plus one Danish and one Finnish entrepreneur, produced Skype, right? So they took the Soviet technology and produced Skype. And I teach at the Tallinn University of Technology and share the campus with Skype. So the question is, some of these high-tech pockets, more of them should have survived. And the thing was, when Spain was integrated into the EU, it was done over 10 years, slowly lowering the tariffs. So the industry survived. If they had done the same thing with Eastern Europe industry would have survived much more than it did. But instead you have this shock therapy. And well, I think you should. But there is. I think you should probably protect some kind of mid-range technology for the home market. That's probably a good idea. And I think approaching this by looking at the import bill, I think it is a good way to start. But by all means, don't sign anything with the EU without having understood the game they're playing. I mean, they don't want the agricultural products from the Ukraine, and they don't want the Ukraine to industrialize, right? So it's really bad. So you know, it would be good if everyone could travel visa-free to the EU, but the cost is enormous, right? And I think not having made that mistake is good. And as I say, probably I understand that the Russians, in many ways, understand these arguments, you know, and they recall, you know, Witte, and when they see that this continuity, it's so I have a certain hope that Russia understands this thing better. And notice the West did not boycott Russian industry, because the experience from South Africa and Zimbabwe was that when these countries were boycotted because of apartheid, their industry grew tremendously. You know, industry as a percentage of GDP in Zimbabwe was more than 30%. They made very sophisticated stuff. They made plows, for instance, for agriculture. I've traveled through Zimbabwe from south to north and looked at all these dead factories. I mean, it's tremendous. And they do crazy things now. So they have free trade in pharmaceutical products, but they still have duty on on the raw materials for pharmaceutical products. So the poor people trying to produce pharmaceuticals in Zimbabwe are hit by tariffs on their raw materials, but the final products can be imported free of duty. So there's so many irrational things going on, and we don't see that because we just see the rhetoric of the thing, right? So I think, you know, going behind the rhetoric, and that's in a way that's the good news with Trump. I mean,
thanks so much. I'm not an economist. I'm a journalist, and I want to ask, telling a story about my shoes. Just 2 or 3 years ago, I used to buy Armenian shoes, but now I can go to Amazon and order whatever I want. And this becomes a problem for many industries like light textile and many things like this, because we face huge producers and huge retailers who can fight and can kill local producers. But on the other hand, they make cheaper but better products, and you cannot explain to your own population and to your own nation why should they buy some local but bad products instead of buying good and imported products. How can we deal with it?
Well, it's a classical problem, you know. In a place like Mexico, anything which was imported was seen as fantastic, but in other countries, you know, you have some economic nationalism. So I think it is possible to explain to people to some extent. And I can tell you that even in Norway, you know, we have this problem of import, and we have a very high VAT also. So if you import by a mail order, you know, you get it without VAT, and it's hurting Norwegian industry, but also Norwegian retailers. So there's been a fight in Parliament. Where is the limit to what you can import without duty? And the question, it has been between 40 euros and 20 euros. So you know, we're discussing the very same thing. And this is a dilemma, in a sense, of the global economy, that we can all prohibit gambling, but if the poor island of Nauru, which has no minerals anymore, nothing, if they say, well, the only way we can survive is gambling, well, if there is one gambling nation in the world, where we can all gamble on the companies based in Nauru. So this is, in a sense, a problem of globalization. But I think it's possible to. I've seen the debate in Norway. I think you have to say, well, we play two roles in this life, right? One as a consumer and one as a producer. So we have to balance the interest of ourselves as producers with ourselves as consumers. So I would try to say that, you know, as a consumer, yes, close down all economic activity in Armenia and we'll just import everything. But if the same Armenian says, well, I'm also a producer, you know, where should we draw the line? We want to keep this industry alive and this trade retail trade alive in Armenia, well, then we have to, these things come through post office, and as long as it don't come on the back of people's back, then you're difficult to stop. But if they come through normal channels, you could actually pick it up on the customs office. And this is a dilemma, and it's not only a dilemma for poor countries, it's also a dilemma for rich countries. But it's a matter of, I think, you can educate people. I think it is actually possible.
My name is Mikhail Rukasyan. I'm a PhD student in economics. So I have two main questions. The first one is, there is a debate going now about increasing the limit of debt in Armenia, because right now it's about 60% of the GDP, and we have a law that prohibits having debt higher than this amount. So my question is, should we try to keep our debt balanced and just try to organize our economy that way, or we should we just increase the debt, invest on infrastructure, on other projects that will have payback in a few years, and hope that our GDP will increase and the debt won't, and we will be able to pay back all that debt a few years later, or maybe just. And the second question is, oh, I forgot the second question. Sorry.
Fine. A few years ago, two American economists at Harvard were famous because they made kind of a magic limit to how much debt a country should have. Well, first of all, a graduate student from a different American university mistakes. But there were some healthy voices out there. The chief economist, the chief economist of Financial Times, Martin Wolf, come and say, well, you can't look at that without a context. When England had won all the wars against France and dominated the world, our debt was, 300% of GDP. But we controlled an empire where the sun never set. So if economists had understood bookkeeping, they would understand that you cannot only look at the liability side of a balance sheet, you also have to look at the asset side. But economists don't do bookkeeping, strangely enough. So, when discussing this debt, don't only look at the liability side, look at the asset side. And it was a similar thing. The U.S. in 1776, after the independence from England, they had a fantastic debt, and so also during the Civil War, they were debt, but they had assets. So these, looking at these blind numbers is confusing, and 60% I would say is not that scaring, and I think perhaps we should try to circulate Jan Kregel, who was a man who actually penned the so-called Stiglitz report on the financial crisis. He's now written a paper on debt as a Ponzi scheme, and this idea of the paradox of saving, that actually if you start saving now, you will actually shrink the economy. I think that's a very valid argument. Any good economist will understand it if you manage to cut the ideology aside. So I think there are good arguments that in some situations, like in Greece and probably here, saving is counterproductive. It just reduces your ability to pay your debt back. So, and I would say it's a matter, a short-term versus long-term matter. I would say invest in infrastructure, invest in education, and problem with education, of course, if you educate people too much and you don't have any jobs, they leave, right? So you have to try to match the job market to education, and this is what the Koreans were very good at. They were increasing the number of engineers and they were increasing jobs for engineers. So I would say, count on some kind of bankruptcy coming back, right? and look at your neighbors. You know, the countries that are much worse off. So you know, don't read the Bible and don't invest in mammon. Don't invest in dead capital. Invest in something that serves life, as Luther would have said, right? And infrastructure is a good example.
Thank you, Professor. I think 2 last questions.
My question is about economic diversity. Do you think that technological diversity of Armenia could be a driving force for economic growth, exponential, even hyperbolic exponential growth of economy? I think in such square of industries as artificial intelligence, as biotechnology, advanced nanotechnology in Armenia, and robotics, and 3D printing, and so on. And the second question is, what do you think, what's the tentative date of economic singularity to happen globally? I mean, in such spheres of the 4th Industrial Revolution. Thank you.
Well, I think clearly the Ukraine would have, could develop niches in these new high-tech businesses. The interesting thing with technology is that it's so unpredictable. You know, in the 1880s, everybody understood whether, you know, the London and New York and Manhattan were drowning in horse manure, and dead horses was a health concern. So what do you do? Well, you had the electrical car, you had electrical trams at the point, and you had the steam car. Obviously, the steam was the old technology. So you know, which one do we choose? And the guy who won was an outsider with the name of Benz, with his explosion engine, right? So completely unpredictable. Right? And now we think that batteries and electricity is the future. Well, I don't remember how these Tesla batteries, how heavy they are, 600-800 kilos, something like that. Is the future really that everyone carries around a battery weighing 600 kilos to move a car? Well, what other technologies are there? Well, there is hydrogen, and a hydrogen engine weighs a couple of kilos, right? So we are in this same game that it looks like one technology will win, and it might be a different one. And in history, it's always been like that. So I think you are definitely in the game you should be in the game of exploring these alternatives. And you mentioned 3D printing. I think that is something which works against the economies of scale. You know, it's something that might revolutionize things and bring shoe production back to Armenia, right? Or many products. So the tremendous decentralization opportunities of 3D printing, I think that would be a great thing for small countries. So it's I think that would be very valuable to look into. So I'm definitely all for that, but I'm just warning that it's incredibly unpredictable what's going to happen. In 1910, if you look at the picture of the future, the sky was filled with dirigibles, right? And then one accident and dirigibles disappeared for about 100 years. Right? These things happen, and it's in a way charming that we don't know. and but diversity is still important, and you have intellectual diversity, and if you manage to, you know, I can imagine links to Armenians all over the place, that you have a 3D Armenian network with people here and people all over the world. That could be very, you know, the death of distance came with the internet, and you could use that clearly.
Thank you. Professor Reinert, I took a right for the last question. You mentioned the case of Belorussia. Would you find this case as the most successful one in the former Soviet Union because they didn't pass through this stage of deindustrialization, or not?
Yes, in a strange, well, Poland is probably the most successful I think for the reasons I said. But as a small country and being an outsider, it's surprising. You know, you find that a Swiss company is investing in Belarus to make rolling stock for trains for Russia. Strangely enough. And there was a mostly private initiative to put up an IT center. And that was a huge success. And the man behind that idea, which got, I think, very little public support, was then sent as the Belarusian ambassador to Washington. And I interviewed him and spoke to him for a long time. And the kind of a contradiction is that you have Lenin on the square, and you have these private entrepreneurs setting up an IT center. So it's confusing, but it shows that you can actually have different ideas running parallelly. You know, in Scandinavia, you know, the trains were always belonged to the state, but the boats didn't. So the idea that, you know, one size fits all, one solution fits all, I think is too simple. But Belarus is interesting because the political situation is not recommendable at all, right?
Of course.
And of course, this is what I'm saying. The advantage of not being a democracy, the advantage of not having to listen to the IMF or the World Bank. I mean, perhaps that should be my last word. That these institutions actually impoverish democracies.
Let me say thank you very much on behalf of the university. It was very interesting. And my sincere thanks to Professor Georgi Derlugyan, who was initiated this coming of Professor Reinert to Armenia. And he is the hosting party, our great friend, Professor of American University in Abu Dhabi, one of the prominent Armenian scientists, very well known in the world. Thank you, Georgi Jan. Thank you very much for here. And I'm sure we also would have one seminar with Professor Reinert on Monday at 1 o'clock in our library. Also, I mean, we cannot host all of you, but I think some of you could be interested in that, and please, most welcome. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Martin, nothing to do with Taron Ajamoglu.